It's time to release the week 1 edition of the JP poll. The JP poll is not actually a poll. You guys are right. I'm just not changing the name because the name JP poll is very catchy and it is a marketing slogan. And if you don't like it, I don't really care. That's disrespectful. I care, but just not enough to change it. The JP poll is a power rating, no different than if we were an odds maker and we ran our sports book over here. These would be the raw numbers we use to generate point spreads. That's how Washington kept winning last year. That's how Washington beat Oregon last year, but stayed beneath Oregon. Doesn't mean they're necessarily incapable of beating Oregon again. In fact, they did 2 times. The dirty little secret around Vegas is last year, Washington would have been a dog a 3rd time if they faced Oregon. And if you disagree with these, you get to go bet on them. That's fine. But by and large, a power rating model I have a lot more fun with than a ranking model because your wins and losses don't matter here necessarily. You aren't what your record says you are necessarily. It is about a little bit different way to view teams. So I've got our own model here, and it's got everything it could possibly have plugged into it. These are preseason numbers, so they are as loose as we will have in the numerical format all year. This stuff fluctuates a whole lot. You got to be, if you're going to be resolute behind this stuff, you've also got to be willing to pivot on a dime. So I'm about to show you, because we got Florida State's new rating baked into this, so I'll show you how far they fell. So let's start off, Jesse, and Colin, let's roll through this. Let me give you a little idea of the gap between teams as well. I see the disclaimer on the screen. I appreciate that. Number 1 through 5 is unchanged. So Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, Texas, and Alabama are the first 5. That's the same as it was a month ago. Now, all I've done is I've talked to as many people as I can from fall camps. Injuries have been baked in here. Texas, even with the running back injuries, it wasn't enough to drop them below Alabama. Just to give you an idea of the gap here, we would have Georgia favored by about 6.75 points against Alabama right now. So they're close to a touchdown gap, 1 through 5. Now, 6 through 10 is where it gets interesting. You would think Penn State being the number 6 team is really high. I think it's a little high too. Not absurdly high, but if I were to rank these teams, I'd have a few of these teams ahead of Ole Miss or ahead of Penn State. But the model is like sky high on Penn State. Penn State's the new Texas, apparently. The model was high on Texas forever, and now everyone's high on Texas, so the model had to find a new pet project, and apparently it's Penn State. Here's what's interesting. There's not a whole lot of drop-off between Bama and Penn State. The drop-off is between Penn State and Ole Miss. There's a 2-point drop-off between number 6 and number 7, which just means on a neutral field, the model would favor Penn State by 2 over Ole Miss. Then all of you would proceed to go bet Ole Miss plus 2. I know that. This is what the model thinks. And we all know I've always been right on this. If anything was ever wrong, it was the model's fault that it was wrong. So Ole Miss is number 7. Notre Dame is number 8. Virtually unchanged. They dropped 1 spot. They, I think, changed places with Ole Miss. Michigan, I bumped them up 2. Had them at 11. They're at 9 now. A&M bumped them up 3 or 4 spots, I think, something like that. That was just due to camp intel. Didn't change them a lot. I mean, to get bumped up 1 or 2 spots, you probably get bumped up 1/4 of a point on your power rating. So that's just a good old-fashioned camp intel bump there. Number 11 through 15, what do we see here? Camp intel bump from Tennessee, which is interesting because they had a big injury to their nickel in fall camp. But in the aggregate, heard enough things that Tennessee, I think, got a 0.5 point bump. Not huge, but it's enough to bump you up 3 spots. Oklahoma's 12. Miami, pretty good bump there. Better depth and versatility in the offensive backfield than I thought they had. Elijah Arroyo, really good player. And so I also think that they got some young DBs with a fair amount of hope there, especially one corner. So they're up 5 spots. They're at number 13. Miami's at 13. LSU's at 14. LSU, a little too much talk about turnovers with Nuss in fall camp for me to just remain unchanged on them. So they dropped 4 spots, which means they dropped 3/4 of a point. Not a huge deal. Missouri's at 15. Let's continue. Oh, by the way, as Colin rolled the slide there, just to finish on that, Miami's 13. I'm going to show you in a second. We've got Florida at 21. Miami goes to Florida, which means we have to bake in home field. The model has Miami minus 1.5. Miami winning by 1.5 this Saturday, which is close to what the point spread is. So, in other words, it would not be at all shocking, and it would not invalidate anything in the model's eyes if Florida at home, as the number 21 team, beat Miami. However, I know what's coming. If Florida wins that thing 24-20 this Saturday, I will get inundated with people who call Miami overrated and it was a farce and where's your JP poll now? And don't worry, we'll be right back here Sunday to defend ourselves as only we can. But just understand, if that happened, it's not too far out of line with what the model would expect with these teams rated where they are. Now, number 16 through 20. Kansas State 16, same as they were. Utah 17, same as they were. Hearing some half-decent things on USC. Some people, and it's been hard to get out there for fall camp, but there are some people who have been able to see some practices. USC may be just a little bit better, maybe just a hair better than the old model thought they were. So we bumped them up 2 spots. Clemson is the same. There's Florida State. Florida State plummeted. Florida State fell all the way to 20th. That was a 3 3/4 point drop. Pretty substantial. Pretty substantial. Now, there are some who will look at this and say, why is Georgia Tech not ahead of Florida State? Well, that's because Florida State would still be favored against Georgia Tech if they played tomorrow by a pretty healthy amount, by 6 or 7 points probably. So this is where you figure out whether this makes sense to you or not. There is no odds maker in his right mind that would favor Georgia Tech on a neutral field against Florida State if they played tomorrow, even though they just played on a neutral field and Georgia Tech won the football game, which they fully deserve to. And if I were ranking the teams, I would have Georgia Tech ahead of Florida State. But this is not a ranking. It is, everyone, a power rating. So that's the difference. Josh, well, what sense does it make to power rate? If it doesn't make sense to you, this is not the video for you. It's very simple. I like to do this because it's a different kind of exercise, and it's a lot more data-based and not so emotion-based. That's why. 21 through 25. Florida's number 21, unchanged. Oklahoma State, 22. Wisconsin, 23. Iowa, 24. Dropped them down 2 spots simply because their projected starter at quarterback actually is starting for them, which disheartens me a little bit. And Iowa State's at 25. I just tweeted the JP poll out, even though I'm live on air, as we finish the segment, just because I want to see my phone light up over here to my immediate left as the show goes on. So there you go. Now, my promise to you, a lot of fluidity in these numbers. So my promise to you, there will be movement. Georgia plays Clemson this Saturday. Ohio State plays Akron. Oh, prayers for Akron. Early running for Sarah McLachlan special. Akron getting 50.5 against Ohio State. Oregon plays, I can't remember who Oregon plays, Texas, Bama. So probably won't have any upsets in the top 5 unless Clemson pulls one off against Georgia. And by the way, man, if that happened, if Clemson were to beat Georgia, again, not the biggest upset in the world, just remember we did the most talented teams thing the other day. Clemson, at least if you believe the 24/7 Sports Talent Composite, 5th most talented roster in the country, getting nearly 2 touchdowns against Georgia, the number 2 most talented roster in the country.